He protected her while I sacrificed everything. Every part of my being had been dedicated to him. The late-night talks, the endless hours I spent helping him, the love I gave unconditionally. But when she appeared, everything shifted. The bond we once shared was no longer important. I was cast aside, left to watch as he prioritized her over me. The sting of betrayal was sharp, but it wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of my transformation. The moment I realized I had been living in a lie, and it was time for me to take control of my own destiny. I had always believed in loyalty, in the strength of the connection we shared. But the truth shattered that illusion. I watched as he protected her, giving her everything I thought was mine, his attention, his care, his love. I had sacrificed my happiness, my future, for him, and this was how he repaid me. I felt myself crumble beneath the weight of betrayal, but somewhere deep inside, a rage began to build. The pain was unbearable, but I would use it to fuel my journey. He had betrayed me, and now it was my turn to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I spent nights questioning myself, wondering where I went wrong. What was it about her that made him forget everything we had? I had always been there for him, always put him first. But she didn't have to fight for his affection. She was everything I wasn't, beautiful, confident, effortless. She didn't know the pain of giving everything, only to be cast aside. But I knew what it felt like to have everything stolen from me, and now I was ready to take it all back. The world would see who I was, someone not to be underestimated, someone who could rise from the ashes of betrayal. The more I watched, the more I realized how much I had allowed myself to be treated like a fool. They would laugh, share moments, and walk around like they had won. But what they didn't know was that I was no longer the same person. The girl who once stood by his side, believing in their love, was gone. In her place stood someone far more dangerous, someone who would make sure he understood the weight of his betrayal. And when the time came, I would be the one laughing. I would take back everything he had stolen, piece by piece. Betrayal is a powerful thing. It doesn't just hurt, it transforms you. And as I stood there, watching them from the distance, I realized that I was no longer the same person who had loved him so desperately. I had become someone else, someone capable of more than just surviving the pain. I was going to rise, stronger than I had ever been, and make him regret every moment he had taken me for granted. I wouldn't let the past define me any longer. I would rewrite my story, and this time the ending would be mine to control. It was the silence that haunted me the most. The silence of knowing I was being replaced, of seeing him turn his back on me, while I stood there, powerless. The quiet was deafening, suffocating. But in that silence, I made a vow to myself. No longer would I allow myself to be a victim of his decisions. I would make my own choices from now on, and I would do whatever it took to ensure he would never forget me. The time for weakness was over. The time for revenge had begun, and I was ready to make my move. They thought they had won. He thought he had won. But I knew better. I had always been the one in control, even when I didn't realize it. The power had always been mine to reclaim. And now, as I stood on the precipice of my transformation, I could feel it, the shift, the change in my very being. I wasn't just going to move on. I was going to make sure he regretted ever turning his back on me. The calm before the storm was coming, and it would leave nothing but devastation in its wake. My heart ached with the pain of his betrayal, but I refused to let it break me. I would not allow myself to be torn apart by his actions. Instead, I focused on the anger that burned within me, using it as fuel. I would become stronger, more powerful than I had ever been before. And when I stood before him again, he would see the woman I had become unbreakable, unshakable, and ready to take back what was mine. He would regret ever thinking I was weak, and he would learn the hard way that betrayal comes with consequences. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream, to run to him and demand answers, to beg for him to come back to me. But I didn't, because I knew that would be the end. Instead, I chose to walk away. I chose to reclaim my power, my dignity, and my self-respect. He had taken everything I had given him, but I would no longer be his fool. I was done with being the girl who would sacrifice herself for someone who didn't deserve it. The new me was coming into existence, and nothing was going to stop me from becoming the woman I was meant to be. The days felt endless as I walked away from him, my heart heavy with the weight of my decision. But every step I took away from him was a step toward something greater. The woman who had once loved him so deeply was no more. In her place stood a woman who had learned the true meaning of strength. And I knew that one day, when the time was right, I would return. But this time, I wouldn't be coming back for him. I would be coming back for myself, to show him exactly who I had become. The more I distanced myself, the clearer my path became. No longer would I let myself be defined by the love I had for him. He had shown me the truth, that I was nothing more than a stepping stone for his desires. But now I would rise. I would become the woman who no one would dare underestimate. I would rebuild myself from the ground up, piece by piece, until I was stronger than ever. And when the time came, I would be ready to show him what it meant to lose everything. As the days passed, I focused on my transformation, both inside and out. I started making decisions for myself, doing things that I had once put on hold for him. I began to rediscover the woman I had once been, the woman who had dreams and ambitions beyond his world. I knew the road to revenge wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I was stronger now. The more I transformed, the more powerful I became. I wasn't just healing, I was becoming something new. And when the time came, he would see just how far I had come. I could feel the change in me, like a fire building inside. The woman who had been left behind was no more. The girl who had once been afraid to stand up for herself was now someone who knew her worth. I wasn't going to let him, anyone, take that from me again. As I trained my mind and body, I realized something crucial. Revenge wasn't about making him suffer. It was about reclaiming my own power. And when I was ready, I would strike. He would never see it coming. He wouldn't recognize the woman who stood before him. The day I finally saw him again, something shifted within me. The old me, the one who would have crumbled at the sight of him, was gone. Instead, I felt calm, centered, and in control. He didn't deserve my anger anymore. He didn't deserve my love. But he would get something else, something far more powerful. He would get the woman who had been reborn from the ashes of betrayal. And as I looked into his eyes, I knew that he could never hurt me again. This time, I held all the cards. I saw the realization in his eyes before he even spoke. He knew something had changed. The woman who stood before him was not the same person who had once adored him. I was stronger now, more powerful, and he was about to learn that betrayal comes at a price. The last time I had been in this position, I was a victim, but now I was the one in control. I would show him exactly what happens when you take someone for granted. The final blow came not in the form of anger or rage, but in quiet justice. I had learned that power didn't need to be loud. It was in the silence, the calculated moves, and the unwavering strength. He looked at me, expecting weakness, but all he saw was a woman who had taken back everything he had stolen. The regret in his eyes was palpable, but it was too late. The woman I had become was far beyond his reach. And with that, I knew my revenge was complete. Justice had been served. The day of reckoning had arrived, and I was ready. My transformation was complete. Every decision I made, every move I took, had led me to this moment. The girl who had once begged for his attention was gone. I had become a woman who commanded it. He wouldn't see it coming. He thought I was weak, that I would remain in the shadows forever. But I had risen. Now, I would make him regret the choices he had made, and I would do it on my terms. The time for waiting was over. Now was the time for action. I watched from the corner of the room as he smiled at her, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. His arrogance was his greatest weakness. He believed he had everything figured out, that he had won, but what he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for so long. The plans I had made, the strength I had built, would all come to fruition in an instant. The woman standing before him now was not the one he had cast aside. This woman was unstoppable, and he would soon understand why. I could see the unease in his eyes as he caught my gaze. It was subtle at first, but I knew what it meant. He recognized the change in me. He could sense the power radiating from every fiber of my being. But it was too late. He had already shown his true colors. Now, it was time for me to show him what happened when you betray someone who loved you. He had thought I would always be there for him, waiting in the shadows, but I wasn't his safety net anymore. I was his reckoning, and he was about to pay. Every movement, every word was calculated. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes I had made before. I wasn't going to beg or plead. He didn't deserve my vulnerability. No, I was going to show him my strength, my power. The person standing before him now wasn't afraid. She had fought too long and too hard to reclaim her life. And when I spoke, every word was infused with the pain, the betrayal, and the strength that had been growing inside me. He could try to run, but there was no escape. He would face the consequences of his actions. The confrontation was inevitable, but it didn't happen the way I had imagined. Instead of rage or tears, I met him with cold, calculated determination. His arrogance faltered as I spoke, and for the first time in years, he realized he didn't have control over me. The way he looked at me, it was a mixture of regret and confusion. He had no idea how powerful I had become, how much I had changed. But I did. And in that moment, I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. It was time for him to feel the weight of his mistakes. The silence between us grew heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He tried to speak, to explain, but I wouldn't let him. The time for explanations had passed. He had stolen my trust, my love, and my time, and now it was my turn to take back what was mine. I had already learned everything I needed to know about him. He had been so confident in his betrayal, so sure that he could walk away unscathed. But he hadn't counted on my strength, on the woman I had become. And now, he would face the consequences. I could see the panic begin to set in, the realization that he was losing control of the situation. The power dynamics had shifted, and he was no longer the one in charge. He thought that I would always be the one to bend, to give in. But he was wrong. I had learned to stand tall, to fight back when necessary. And now, I was using that strength against him. His every word, every attempt to regain his footing, was a desperate plea, but it was too late. He had lost, and I was going to make sure he understood why. He reached out, but I stepped back, my gaze never wavering from his. His touch no longer had the power it once did. He thought I would crumble at the sight of him, but I stood firm. The girl who had once clung to him for dear life had vanished. In her place was a woman who had taken control of her own fate. I wouldn't allow him to manipulate me again, to make me feel small. I had reclaimed my power, and I was ready to take everything back. This was my moment, and I was going to make it count. He had tried to break me, to make me believe I wasn't enough, that I would never be anything without him. But he had only succeeded in pushing me to become the person I was now, the woman who would stop at nothing to reclaim her life. As I watched the realization spread across his face, I knew he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had lost me forever, but the consequences didn't stop there. I was going to make sure he knew that betrayal doesn't come without a price. The final blow wasn't physical. It wasn't a shout or a fight. It was simply the truth that I had moved on, that I no longer needed him. I had become someone else, someone who didn't rely on him or anyone else for validation. And as I walked away, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The power was in my hands now. I had taken back what was mine, and as I looked back one last time, I knew he would never forget the woman who had been reborn from his betrayal. As I continued walking, the weight of the moment didn't settle in right away. It was only later, when I found myself alone, that I realized how far I had come. The journey from betrayal to empowerment had been long, but now I could see the beauty in it all. Every sacrifice, every painful step had been leading me here, toward my freedom. I wasn't just moving on from him. I was building a future for myself, one that didn't rely on his approval or affection. I was stronger, smarter, and finally in control of my own story. He tried to reach out to me again, of course. It was predictable. He didn't understand the depth of what he had lost, but I did. He thought that after all this time, all the pain, I would fall back into his arms. But I didn't. I had already shed the remnants of who I used to be. The girl who would forgive him, the girl who thought love was enough, she was gone. And in her place stood someone who knew her worth, who understood that sometimes the greatest revenge is walking away and never looking back. He didn't have the power over me that he once did. His calls went unanswered, his messages ignored. He kept trying to weave his way back into my life, but I could feel the distance between us growing wider with each attempt. The man who once had me at his mercy was now irrelevant in my world, and every time he reached out, it only made me realize how much I had gained by letting go. He hadn't just lost me. He had lost my respect, my loyalty, and my trust. Those things would never be given to him again. It wasn't just about getting back at him anymore. The revenge was no longer my focus. What mattered was reclaiming myself, reclaiming the parts of me he had stolen. He had reduced me to a shadow of myself, always second to his desires. But no more. Now I was rising, and each day that passed made me feel more powerful, more alive. Every decision I made was for me, no one else. He had taken enough. Now it was time for me to take back control and build a life that was truly mine. Every inch of me had been broken down, but I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. And now I wasn't afraid to stand on my own. The confidence that had once eluded me now flowed through me. It was as though I had finally discovered the strength that had always been inside me. The woman who had once craved his affection was gone, and in her place stood a force to be reckoned with. No one, least of all him, could take this power away from me again. I had learned my worth, and I would never forget it. The realization of what he had done to me hit him slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, he couldn't grasp the change, but over time, it became clear. I was no longer someone who needed him, who depended on him, and that terrified him. The more I thrived, the more he saw what he had lost. The pride that once defined him, the arrogance that had pushed me away, was now his downfall. It wasn't just about me moving on. It was about me succeeding without him, thriving without his influence. and that was the ultimate revenge. As I continued to move forward, the life I had dreamed of began to unfold. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it was more than I had ever imagined. Every new achievement, every new step I took was a reminder of how far I had come. The bitterness of betrayal had faded, replaced by the sweet taste of independence. I had shed the weight of the past and emerged victorious. The power I had gained, the strength I had built, was mine to keep. And as long as I held on to that, nothing could stop me. One day, I ran into him unexpectedly. The old me would have faltered, would have struggled to keep her composure. But not now. I stood tall, unwavering as he tried to speak, tried to reach out once more. But there was nothing left to say. He no longer held any power over me. The man who had once meant everything was now a stranger, a distant memory that no longer had the ability to affect me. I had let go, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my freedom. The encounter was brief, and when it ended, I walked away with my head held high. He watched me leave, but this time, there was no regret in my heart. No part of me wished for him to come after me, to beg for my forgiveness. I didn't need it. The person I was now had no place for that kind of weakness. He had done everything to push me away, and I had finally accepted that. He didn't deserve my energy, my thoughts, or my time. I had everything I needed within myself, and that was all that mattered. I had risen, and I was unstoppable. I smiled to myself as I walked away from that brief encounter. The bitterness I once held had vanished, and I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The final act of revenge wasn't in him feeling sorry for what he had done. It was in me finding peace, in me knowing that I was better off without him. The man who had tried to destroy me had failed. I had learned, grown, and emerged stronger. And in the end, he would be left with nothing but the memory of the woman he could never have again. The weeks that followed were filled with triumphs I had never thought possible. I found myself flourishing in ways I hadn't imagined, each day a new opportunity to prove to myself that I was capable of greatness. The power I had sought in others was now something I owned completely. I was no longer dependent on anyone's approval or love. I had become my own source of strength. And as I reached each milestone, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that I had earned every bit of it through sheer determination and resilience. I often thought about the day we crossed paths again. I had expected the rush of anger, the need to confront him, but none of that came. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I had finally let go of the past. The pain, the betrayal, it all seemed so distant now. I was no longer that girl who had been consumed by him. I had outgrown the version of myself that clung to the hope of redemption. I was better than that. And in that moment, I knew that I had truly healed. The silence was loud, but it was the silence of peace, not emptiness. I had spent so many years searching for answers, for closure, for validation. But in the end, I realized that I didn't need any of it. I didn't need him to apologize or regret his actions. I didn't need him to acknowledge my pain. What I needed was to acknowledge my own strength, my own ability to rise above it all. And once I did that, everything changed. I was no longer chasing after what he had taken. I had created something far better. He called once more, but this time, there was no hesitation on my part. I didn't even bother to answer. The days of waiting for him to make things right were long gone. I had learned that waiting on someone else for my happiness only led to disappointment. I had become my own source of joy. And as his name flashed across my screen, I couldn't help but feel pity. He would never understand the power I had gained. And that was the greatest form of justice I could ever receive. I moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose. The future was bright, not because it was free from pain, but because I had learned to face it head on. Every obstacle that once seemed insurmountable now felt like a challenge I was more than capable of overcoming. My past no longer held me captive. I was free to live my life on my own terms. And with each step I took, I felt the weight of the past lifting, piece by piece. I had emerged from the darkness, and now I was ready to embrace the light. Looking back, I realized that everything had happened for a reason. The pain, the betrayal, the heartache, it had all been a part of my transformation. Without it, I wouldn't have discovered my true strength. I wouldn't have learned how to rise from the ashes. And I wouldn't have become the woman I was today. I no longer needed to seek revenge. The best revenge was in my success, in my growth. I had outgrown the need to prove anything to anyone. All that mattered was the woman I had become, and nothing could take that away from me. His presence was a distant memory, one I didn't think about often anymore. But when I did, it wasn't with anger. It was with understanding. I knew he had made his choices, just as I had made mine. And now, the consequences of those choices were clear. He would never have the chance to hurt me again. I had built a life that was stronger than any betrayal, and that was something he could never take from me. The scales had tipped in my favor, and there was no going back for either of us. I often wondered if he ever thought about me. Did he regret what he had done? Did he ever wish he had treated me differently? I would never know the answers, and honestly, I didn't care. What mattered now was that I had moved on, that I had taken back control of my life. My happiness no longer depended on him. I had created a future for myself that was built on my terms, and nothing could shake that foundation. The man who once held my heart now held no power over me. I had claimed my freedom, and I would never let it go. The final chapter of this story had been written, and I was the author. The pain of the past was no longer a burden I carried. Instead, it had become a lesson, a reminder of how far I had come. I had transformed from someone who had been broken into someone who had the strength to rebuild. And with that strength, I had created a future that was entirely mine. There was no room for the past in my new life. I had risen, and no one would ever make me fall again. The world ahead was mine to conquer. I had already faced the worst of it, and now nothing seemed impossible. I was no longer the girl who had been left behind, who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had reclaimed her life, her power, and her happiness. And as I stepped forward into the future, I knew that nothing could stop me. The journey had been painful, but it had been worth it. I had become someone no one could break. And that was the greatest victory of all. The more I thrived, the clearer it became to me. I had won, not just in the way I had imagined, not through vengeance, but in a far greater, more profound way. I had rebuilt my life, and each day it grew stronger. There were no longer any pieces of my soul left behind in the past. I was whole again, but this time I was better. The woman who walked confidently through life wasn't the same one who had been betrayed. I had evolved, and the best part was I had done it alone. He couldn't break me anymore because I was unbreakable. Every success was a victory, not over him, but over the version of myself that had once been so dependent on him. I realized that I hadn't been just waiting for him to return, to redeem himself. No, I had been waiting for myself to find my own worth. And now that I had, everything felt different. The life I was living was mine, truly and completely. I could look into the mirror and see someone who had grown, who had fought for her own happiness. I had earned every ounce of peace, and no one, least of all him, could take that from me. He tried again, months later, to show up in my life. He thought that after all this time, I might be willing to forgive him, to take him back. But the truth was, there was nothing left to forgive. I had forgiven myself long ago for ever thinking I needed him. The door he had once walked through was now locked, and I had thrown away the key. His regret wasn't my problem. It was his burden to carry, and I wasn't going to let it become mine. I had moved on, and I would never look back. His face haunted me once more, but this time it wasn't with pain. It was with a strange sense of closure. I could finally see him for what he truly was, not a source of my happiness, but a lesson in disguise. He had pushed me to the edge, only for me to discover that I had wings. I had flown, and as I soared higher, I realized that the past no longer had the power to hold me down. His regret didn't matter to me. It was my own journey, my own strength, that now defined my life. And one day, I saw him again, but it wasn't the dramatic confrontation I had once imagined. It was peaceful, almost distant. He was no longer a part of my world, and I had no desire for him to be. I walked past him, as if he were a stranger, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just calm. That was my final victory, the ability to see him, to acknowledge him, without being moved. I had come full circle, and I had finally reached a place where I no longer needed closure. I had created my own. The moment he realized that I had moved on, that I no longer felt anything, his regret deepened. And I could see it in his eyes. He knew, in that moment, that he had lost me forever. He had lost me because I had learned to walk away, to let go, and to never look back. I wasn't the same girl who would have fallen for his empty promises. I had built a new life, a better one. And the realization that he could never be a part of it cut him deeper than any confrontation could have. He regretted it all, but it was too late. I had everything I needed now: strength, independence, peace, and I no longer needed anything from him. His presence, once the center of my world, had become insignificant. I had learned that the greatest form of power was the ability to stand on my own without needing validation from anyone else. I had claimed that power, and no one, not even him, could take it from me. My life was no longer a reflection of what he had done to me. It was a reflection of what I had done for myself. The real reward wasn't seeing him suffer, wasn't in watching him realize how much he had lost. No, the real reward was in how far I had come. The woman I was now was the one who had learned to rise from the ashes, who had faced the deepest betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. I had built a life on my terms. And with that, I realized there was no greater justice than the life I had created. It was mine. He couldn't take that from me. And as I walked away, I knew I had won. In the end, I wasn't interested in revenge or redemption. What I wanted was peace, and I had found it. The man who had once held my heart in his hands was now nothing more than a faded memory. The scars he left behind had healed, and with each passing day, I became more and more convinced that I had been right to let him go. The past was gone, and the future was mine. There was nothing more to be said. I had learned my worth, and that was all I needed. I finally understood what true strength was. It wasn't about fighting back, about trying to prove something to him. It was about walking away, about letting go, and about reclaiming my own happiness. The moment I realized this, everything changed. I had found the peace I had searched for, not by confronting him, but by confronting myself. I had done what I needed to do to heal. And in doing so, I had created a life that was better than any I had ever imagined. A life that no one could take from me,